The stagecoach hit a rut so deep that Mamie Thatcher grabbed the door handle with both hands and held on like the world itself was trying to throw her loose. And when the wheels finally found flat ground again and the dust settled around the windows, she saw the painted wooden sign nailed to a post at the edge of the road, Caldwell Creek, Kansas, and every muscle in her body turned to cold water. She had promised herself she would not flinch when she saw that name. She had rehearsed the moment a dozen times on the long ride west from St. Louis, sitting across from a traveling dry goods salesman who smelled of tobacco and spoke too much about weather. She had told herself she was a different woman now, 26 years old, clear-eyed, carrying nothing but a carpetbag and the kind of quiet determination that gets built slowly out of loss and hard years. She had told herself that Caldwell Creek was just a town, the same as any other town in this enormous, indifferent Kansas plain. The sign did not care what she had told herself. It was the summer of 1882, and Caldwell Creek was a cattle town in the early part of its loud and rowdy prime. The Kishom Trail ran near enough that every spring and summer the streets filled with trail hands who had ridden up from Texas with months of work in their pockets, and no plan for any of it except to spend it fast and loud. The town had grown accordingly. A main street with a proper hotel, 2 saloons, a livery, a general store, a small bank with new brick facing, a land office that always had men standing outside arguing, and a sheriff's office with iron bars on its single window that faced the street. There were families here now, which meant a schoolhouse at the east end of town and a white church whose bell needed replacing. There was a newspaper, the Caldwell Creek Courier, published every Thursday by a man named Gerald Pratt who considered himself the moral authority of the county. There was a telegraph office. There was, as of 3 months ago, a hotel dining room that served actual food on actual china plates. Caldwell Creek was not a dying place. It was a living, breathing, arguing place, full of ambition and dust and the constant smell of horse and cattle. And somewhere inside it, buried in the memories of the people who had been here 12 years ago, was the name Mamie Thatcher, and every black and ugly lie that had been told about it. The stage pulled up in front of the hotel, and the driver climbed down from the box and opened the door with the automatic ceremony of a man who had done it 10,000 times. The salesman stepped out first, then Mamie. She set one foot on the iron step and then the other on the hard-packed dirt of the main street, and she stood straight, and she did not look at the ground. She looked at the street. She looked at the people on the boardwalks who were already looking at her the way people in small towns always look at someone arriving on the stage, not with recognition yet, only with the idle interest of people who have little enough new to look at. None of them recognized her. She had been 14 years old when she left. She was a woman now, and she looked like one. She picked up her carpetbag and walked into the hotel. The man at the front desk was young and pimpled and helpful, and he gave her a room on the second floor without any trouble at all. She climbed the stairs, found the room, set her bag on the bed, and stood at the window looking out over the main street. A wagon rolled past carrying grain sacks. 2 men on the boardwalk across the street were having a conversation about something that made one of them wave his hat in the air. A dog lay in the shade of the overhang outside the hardware store and paid attention to nothing. Mamie Thatcher had come back to Caldwell Creek for one reason, and the reason was not sentiment. She had come back because her mother had written to her the first letter in 3 years, carefully forwarded through 3 different addresses, because Mamie had never stopped moving long enough to have a permanent one. And the letter had said that a man named Doyle Prentice was trying to have the Thatcher land claim formally dismissed and reissued in his own name. Her mother's land. 40 acres on the Western Creek side that her father had filed on in 1870 and worked until his back gave out and then his lungs. And her mother, now 61 and alone, had been working since. It was good land. Doyle Prentice wanted it, and Mamie was the only one left who could fight for it, because her mother's hands shook now and her eyes were going, and her brother Calvin had died of fever in New Mexico 2 years back, and there was nobody else. She did not intend to stay long. She intended to find a lawyer, file the appropriate papers, face down Doyle Prentice and whatever allies he had assembled, and leave. She intended to do it quietly and quickly, with as little attention as possible. She intended to go unrecognized. She was standing at that window, still wearing her travel coat, still holding the room key, when she heard someone on the street below say the name. She did not hear it said in connection with her. She heard it said in connection with a horse. A man was asking another man whether he had seen Arthur Keller's bay horse near the livery, and the other man said he thought he had, and the first man said Arthur would want to know because that horse had a loose shoe. Arthur Keller. Mamie pressed her fingers against the window frame and felt the wood warm from the afternoon sun. She had not thought about Arthur Keller in a long time. Or rather, she had thought about him in the way you think about things that belong to a version of yourself that no longer exists, with a sort of distant sadness. The way you might think about a house you used to live in that burned down. He had been 18 when she left. He had been the blacksmith's second son, serious and quiet, with big hands and a way of listening that made you feel heard even when he did not say anything back. He had been her friend, the only person in this town in the end who had refused to believe the thing they were saying about her. Not that it had mattered. She had still had to go. She turned away from the window and began to unpack her bag. She had come on a Tuesday. On Wednesday morning she came downstairs early, before most of the hotel was awake, and ate a quiet breakfast in the dining room, and then went to find a lawyer. The land office was the most obvious starting point, so she walked there with her carpet bag. She had brought the paperwork her mother had sent, the original land grant certificate, the tax receipts, the water rights documentation, and she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The man behind the desk was not the man she remembered from 12 years ago. This man was younger, somewhere in his mid-30s, with spectacles and a careful manner. He said his name was Garrison. She said her name was Mamie Thatcher, and she needed to inquire about a land claim dispute, and she watched his face with the careful attention she had developed over years of needing to know quickly what kind of ground she was standing on. His face did something complicated. He knew the name. She could see him sorting through what he knew about it, deciding how much of that sorting to let show. He settled on professional courtesy, which was the right choice, and she was grateful for it. He looked at her papers. He asked several careful questions. He told her that yes, Doyle Prentice had filed a challenge with the county 3 weeks ago on the grounds of abandonment, claiming the land had been left uncultivated for more than 18 months, which was the threshold for a reclaim under the current territorial statutes. Mamie explained that the land had not been abandoned, that her mother had been living on it continuously, that there were neighbors who could testify to that effect, and that the abandonment claim was fabricated. Garrison nodded in the measured way that lawyers and land clerks share, the nod that means I am listening, and I am reserving judgment simultaneously. He told her she would need proper legal representation, and that the county's land arbitration hearing was scheduled for the second Friday of the following month, which gave her approximately 3 weeks. He gave her the name of the only practicing attorney in Caldwell Creek, a man named Horace Webb. She thanked him and left. She was standing on the boardwalk outside the land office, putting her papers carefully back into her bag, when she heard the voice. Mamie Thatcher. It was not loud. It was not a shout. It was the voice of a man who had seen something unexpected and named it instinctively, the way you name something before you have decided what to do about it. She looked up. He was standing 10 feet away on the same boardwalk, having clearly just come out of the hardware store next door, holding a length of chain in one hand. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she was simply seeing him with adult eyes for the first time. He was 30 years old now, the same age she was minus 4 years, and the boy she had known had grown into something that the Kansas sun and honest work had shaped with considerable attention to detail. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried 3 days of beard and eyes that were the particular gray-green she had not thought about in years and was apparently not finished thinking about. Arthur Keller. He was staring at her the way a man stares at something he is not entirely sure is real. Mamie straightened her spine. "Hello, Arthur. You are here," he said, which was not quite a statement and not quite a question, more like a man confirming the reality of a thing by saying it aloud. "I am." He looked at her for another moment, and then he looked at the chain in his hand as if he had forgotten it was there, and then he looked back at her. "How long have you been here?" "Since yesterday afternoon." "Are you staying?" 3 weeks, she said. "Maybe a little more. There is a legal matter." Something shifted in his expression, something that looked like it might have been relief before he covered it with the careful blankness of a man who had learned not to show too much. He nodded. Then he said, "The land claim." She blinked. "You know about it. It has been the talk of the county for 3 weeks," he said. "Doyle Prentice is not a subtle man." He paused. "Your mother has been trying to manage it alone. She is a stubborn woman." "Yes," Mamie said, "she is." A silence fell between them. It was not comfortable, and it was not entirely uncomfortable. It was the silence of 12 years compressed into a single moment on a hot boardwalk in Kansas, with the sound of the street going on around them as if none of it mattered. "Are you going to see her today?" Arthur asked. "This afternoon. I need to speak to the lawyer first." He nodded again. He shifted the chain from one hand to the other. He seemed to be deciding something. "Horace Webb is decent, but he does not have much fire in him," he said. "If you need someone to speak plainly to the county arbiters, you will need someone else as well, someone they know. And who would that be?" "I could think of someone," he said, and for the first time since he had said her name, the corner of his mouth moved in something that was the distant cousin of a smile. Then he seemed to catch it and bring it back to neutral. "You should go see Horace. Come to the smithy after if you want to talk. I am there most of the day." He touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers and walked on down the boardwalk, and Mamie watched him go for longer than was strictly necessary before she turned in the opposite direction to find Horace Webb. The lawyer's office was small and smelled of old paper and linseed oil. Horace Webb was a slight man of perhaps 50, with a white mustache and the permanently worried expression of a man who understood the law well enough to know all the ways it could be used against the people it was supposed to protect. He read her papers with great care. He asked questions. He wrote things down. He confirmed what Garrison at the land office had told her and added several layers of complication on top. Doyle Prentice, it turned out, was not just a land-hungry opportunist acting alone. He had the quiet backing of the county commissioner, a man named Harland Voss, who had his own reasons for wanting the Thatcher parcel. It sat on a stretch of the creek that Voss wanted for a proposed irrigation scheme that would benefit several of his business interests considerably. Prentice was the instrument. Voss was the machinery behind him. It was the kind of arrangement that small western towns produced regularly and reliably, the kind that looked like a simple land dispute from the outside, and was a much dirtier thing underneath. Mamie sat very still in the small wooden chair across from Horace Webb and listened to all of it, and did not let any of what she felt show on her face. She had learned that particular skill in hard circumstances, and she was not about to unlearn it now. "Can we win?" she asked. Webb pressed his lips together. "The original claim is solid. Your mother has been in continuous residence. The abandonment argument is weak on its face, but Prentice and Voss have friends on the arbitration panel, and that is the difficulty." "What kind of friends?" "The kind that have been having dinner together for the past 5 years, Webb said. He said it without bitterness, only with the flat accuracy of a man reporting weather. "We can make the legal argument. Whether it is heard fairly is another question." Mamie thought about what Arthur had said on the boardwalk. Someone who could speak plainly to the county arbiters. Someone they knew. She thanked Webb, arranged a fee, and left. The smithy was at the south end of the main street, set back a little from the other buildings because of the heat and the noise of it. She could hear it before she could see it, the particular rhythm of hammer on iron, steady and unhurried, the sound of a man who knows exactly what he is doing. She walked around to the wide open front of the building and stood at the edge of the shade. Arthur had his back to her. He was working a piece of iron on the anvil, turning it with tongs between strikes, and he moved with the concentrated efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that it was part of his body, rather than a skill he applied to it. He had taken his outer shirt off in the heat and was working in his undershirt, and his arms were the arms of a blacksmith, which is to say they looked like they had been carved from something harder than ordinary men are made of. He sensed her there before she spoke and turned, setting the hammer down on the anvil block. "How was Horace?" he asked. "Honest," she said. "He told me what we are up against." She stepped further into the shade and told him what Webb had said about Voss and the arbitration panel. Arthur listened without interrupting. He picked up a rag and wiped his hands, and he listened. When she finished, he said, "Harland Voss has been building that arrangement for 3 years. He is patient and he is careful and he does not like losing." "Can he be stopped?" Arthur looked at her steadily. "My father knows every man on that arbitration panel, not as a social matter, as a business matter. They have all needed ironwork at some point. My father has never asked for anything in return, which means he has considerable credit with them." Mamie understood. "Your father would do this." "My father respected your father," Arthur said. "He thought what happened 12 years ago was a sorry business. He said so at the time, though perhaps not loudly enough." The air between them changed slightly at the mention of it, the thing that had happened 12 years ago, the reason she had left, the buried name. Neither of them looked away. "What did they say about me?" she asked. "Exactly. I was told things at the time, but I was 14 years old and frightened, and I did not understand all of it." Arthur set the rag down. He leaned against the anvil with his arms crossed and looked at the ground for a moment. "You know what they said. I want to hear it said plainly." He was quiet for a moment. "They said your father had stolen money from Prentice, that he had been running a scheme to cheat buyers on the cattle weight at the trading post where he worked. Doyle Prentice started the story and it spread fast. By the time anyone thought to question it, your father was too sick to defend himself and your family had fewer friends than you needed." He paused. "The money they said he took was never found because there was no money. I believe that now as I believed it then." "You were the only one who did," she said. "I was 18, he said. "I did not know how to be useful about it. I am sorry for that." Mamie felt something in her chest shift, something that had been sitting in the same place for a long time and had begun to feel permanent. "You were a boy. You could not have done anything differently. I could have been louder about it. You could have been killed for it," she said. "Doyle Prentice was not a gentle man even then." Arthur looked at her. "He is less gentle now." The afternoon was moving along, the light changing outside the smithy's open front from white to the beginning of gold. Mamie became aware of how long she had been standing here and was not entirely sure she wanted to leave. "I need to go see my mother," she said. "Take the road west from the church. It is easier going than the direct path." "I remember the way." He nodded. He picked up his tongs again and turned back toward the forge. Then, without turning around, he said, "Come find me when you get back, if you want." She left without answering, but she was aware, walking back through the main street toward the stable where she had arranged for a horse, that her heart was doing something complicated that had nothing to do with land claims or arbitration panels. The ride out to her mother's place took 40 minutes on the road Arthur had described. The land opened up around her as she left town, the flat Kansas plain spreading in every direction with that particular combination of enormity and intimacy it always had in the late afternoon, the sky taking up 3/4 of everything, the grass gold and moving, the creek line visible as a darker green ribbon threading westward. She remembered this land. It had been in her bones since childhood and the years away had not taken it out. Her mother was sitting on the porch when she arrived, and for a moment Mamie could not move because the sight of her mother, smaller than she remembered, slower in her movements, but with that same straight back and those same eyes that did not miss anything, was almost more than she had prepared herself for. They held each other for a long time without saying much. Her mother's name was Ruth Thatcher, and she had been a formidable woman once, and was still formidable in the way that certain old trees are formidable. They have lost limbs to storms, but the core is harder than ever. She made coffee, and they sat at the table in the small kitchen where Mamie had grown up eating every meal, and Ruth told her everything that had happened with Prentice and Voss with the careful precision of someone who had been waiting to tell it to the right person. 3 weeks ago, Prentice had arrived with 2 men, and a county notice saying that the Thatcher claim was under formal review. He had been polite about it in the way that men are polite when they are entirely confident that politeness will not cost them anything. He had suggested to Ruth that she might want to consider selling voluntarily, that it would be simpler for everyone, and Ruth had told him what he could do with his suggestion in language that a woman of 61 should not, according to Doyle Prentice, have known. He had left, and the notice had remained. Mamie told her mother about the meeting with Horace Webb. She told her about Arthur Keller's offer regarding his father. She watched her mother's face carefully as she said Arthur's name. "He is a good man," Ruth said. "His father is a good man. The whole family is decent people." She looked at her coffee cup. "He has asked about you, over the years, not in a way that draws attention. He just asks sometimes if I have heard from you." Mamie said nothing. "He is not married," Ruth said, in the tone of a woman who is stating a fact and will say no more about it, and also is watching very carefully for a response. "Mother," Mamie said. "I am only saying he is a good man," Ruth said, and picked up her coffee cup. They talked for another 2 hours. They talked about Calvin and the grief of him, and they talked about the land and what it meant, and they talked about the things that needed doing and the years that had passed. And by the time Mamie rode back toward town, the sun was low and the sky was every shade of orange and pink, and the world felt both unbearably large and, for the first time in a very long time, something that might possibly include a place for her. She went to the smithy, but the fire was banked and the tools were put away, and Arthur was not there. She stood at the open front of the quiet building for a moment and then walked back to the hotel. The next morning she found him at the breakfast table in the hotel dining room. She stopped in the doorway when she saw him, and he looked up from his coffee and saw her stop, and something passed between them that was quick and honest, and then they were both very careful about their expressions again. "May I?" she asked, nodding toward the empty chair across from him. "Please," he said. They ate breakfast together with the careful ease of 2 people who are being very deliberate about not rushing something. They talked about practical things, the case, the arbitration, the question of whether Arthur's father, a man named James Keller who was 63 years old and well regarded by everyone in the county who had ever needed a wagon wheel repaired, would be willing to speak to the arbiters. "I spoke to him last night," Arthur said. "Already. I went out to the house. He lives 2 miles east now with my sister's family." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "He said he would do it. He said he should have done more 12 years ago and that this was perhaps the Lord giving him a second opportunity." Mamie felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She looked at her plate. "Are you all right?" Arthur asked. He said it quietly with no particular performance of concern, just the plain question. "I did not expect to find people here who were on our side," she said. "I came back prepared to fight, and I was prepared to fight alone." "You are not alone," he said. It was a simple sentence. He said it simply. It landed in her chest with the weight of something much larger than its 4 words. She looked up at him. He was looking back at her with those gray-green eyes and the expression that she was beginning to recognize. Not the careful blankness, but something underneath it. Something that had been waiting a long time to be allowed to exist. She did not say anything. She picked up her coffee cup. He picked up his. They drank in the kind of silence that is not empty at all. Over the following days, Mamie settled into the rhythm of what needed doing. She met with Horace Webb twice more and reviewed every document. She rode out to her mother's land and cataloged the evidence of continuous occupation, the vegetable garden, the repaired fence lines, the chickens Ruth kept, the winter provisions stored in the root cellar, the neighbors on either side who had seen Ruth working the land through every season. She wrote down everything. She organized it with the precision she had developed working for 6 years as a secretary for a firm in St. Louis, a job that had given her skills she had not expected to need in a land dispute in Kansas, and was now deeply grateful for. Arthur helped. He helped in the practical way of a man who knows a place and its people, who can tell her which neighbor will speak most credibly, and which is better kept away from official proceedings, who knows that the water rights document needs to be cross-referenced with the county survey records from 1871, rather than the later ones which had a known error in the boundary descriptions. He helped in the way of someone who had been thinking about this family's situation for years without being asked to, and had accumulated a great deal of useful information as a result. They fell into a habit of meeting in the evenings, not by arrangement exactly, but by the reliable logic of two people who both tended toward the end of the day, feeling like they needed to think through the day's developments with someone they trusted. The hotel had a small porch off the side that faced away from the main street, with 2 wooden chairs, and they sat there in the evenings with coffee or sometimes something stronger and talked. They talked about the case, and then, as the evenings progressed, they talked about other things. He told her about his life since she had left, the years of learning the smithy trade fully from his father, the way the cattle trade had changed Caldwell Creek, the family matters, a friend he had lost 2 years ago to a horse accident, the small pleasures of a life that was largely his own to manage. She told him about St. Louis and the years before that, the itinerant period when she had moved constantly, the sense of rootlessness she had carried for a long time and had partly made her peace with and partly had not. He listened with the same quality of attention she remembered from when they were young, total and unhurried, as if what she was saying was the only thing happening in the world. On the 4th evening she asked him why he had believed her, why, at 18, when everyone around him had accepted Prentice's story about her father, he had refused to. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark fields beyond the porch. "Your father," he said, "would come into the smithy sometimes, for repairs or just to talk with my father. And once I was there, I was maybe 15, and there was a discussion about a buyer who had tried to shortchange my father on an order. And your father said something about it that I never forgot. He said that a man who cheats in business has made his whole life dishonest, not just his accounting. He said he would rather go without than gain by dishonesty." He paused. "I was 15. I did not have a great deal of experience of people, but I knew that was not the voice of a man who would later steal cattle weights." Mamie looked at her hands in her lap. "He was a good man," she said. "He was," Arthur said. "People believed Prentice because Prentice was louder and had more money and my father was sick and could not fight back," she said. "That is the whole truth of it, not any more complicated than that." "No," Arthur said. "Not more complicated than that." He looked at her. "But you came back and you are fighting now. Someone has to. It does not have to be you." "Yes, it does," she said. "It absolutely does." He nodded, and in the dark she could see that he understood and agreed and would not argue it, and there was something in that, in being understood without having to explain or justify, that was so unfamiliar she felt it like a physical thing. On the 6th day, the trouble she had been waiting for arrived. She was coming out of Webb's office with a portfolio of organized documents when she found Doyle Prentice standing on the boardwalk, as if he had been waiting for her, which he had. He was 54 years old now, a heavy-set man with a red face and the kind of confidence that comes from a long career of getting away with things. He had 2 men with him, not as obvious muscle as they might once have been, but not subtle either. He was wearing a good hat. "Miss Thatcher," he said. She stopped and looked at him. She did not speak first. "I understand you have taken it upon yourself to involve lawyers in what is a simple county matter," he said. "I have retained legal counsel in a legal matter," she said. "That is standard practice." "It will complicate things for your mother," he said, "unnecessarily." The process could take quite a long time if people choose to make it contentious, and your mother is not a young woman. It would be a kindness to her to conclude this simply. Mamie looked at him with the full regard of a woman who has been away from this town for 12 years and has had those years to think about exactly this man and exactly this kind of conversation. "What you are describing as simple," she said, "is my mother being pushed off land she has lived on and worked for 12 years on the basis of a claim that is factually false. I do not consider that simple, and I do not consider your interest in her well-being credible. If you want to make an argument about the land, make it at the arbitration hearing, where it can be heard properly." Prentice's face did the thing that the faces of men like him do when a woman speaks to them this way, a brief but vivid rearrangement of expression before the social smoothness comes back over it. "Your family has already caused enough disruption in this county," he said. "Coming back here does not change the history." "No," she agreed. "It does not change the history. It only adds to it." She walked past him and did not look back. She told Arthur about it that evening on the porch. She told it calmly and completely, the way she had learned to report things that had disturbed her, and when she finished, she found that her hands were shaking slightly, which she had not been aware of during the telling. Arthur reached across the space between the two chairs and put his hand over both of hers, one big warm hand covering hers without any hesitation or ceremony, the way you cover something that needs steadying. She looked at his hand over hers and did not move. "He is trying to frighten you," Arthur said. "I know," she said. "He mostly succeeded." "That is not weakness," he said. "That is sense. Prentice is a man who does harm when he is thwarted. Knowing that is not the same as being stopped by it." She turned her hands over under his and held on. He let her. They sat like that for a while in the warm night, with the sound of the town coming to them faintly from around the corner, and the dark field lying quiet and wide beyond the porch edge. It was the first time they had touched. Neither of them made anything of it, and both of them did. The following day, something happened in the town that Mamie had not anticipated and could not control. Gerald Pratt, the newspaper editor, had become aware of her presence and her purpose, and on Thursday morning the Caldwell Creek Courier appeared with a front-page piece that described the land dispute in the careful language of journalism that manages to imply a great deal without technically asserting it. Pratt described Mamie as the daughter of the late Martin Thatcher, and he described the dispute in factual terms, but he also described the history, or rather, a version of it that treated Prentice's story about Martin Thatcher's dishonesty as settled fact. Mamie read the paper standing in the street in front of the hotel and felt the particular cold fury of a person watching a dead man's reputation be buried a second time. Arthur appeared at her elbow so quickly she nearly startled. He had clearly already read it. His jaw was set in a way she was learning to recognize. "Gerald Pratt," he said. "I need to speak to him," she said. "I know." They went together. The newspaper office was half a block down, a narrow building with the press visible through the front window. Pratt was there, a thin man of perhaps 45 with ink on his hands and the defensive alertness of a man who knows he has printed something that someone is about to object to. Mamie was very calm. She put the paper on his desk and she explained to him, in precise and well-organized language, exactly what the documented facts of her father's case were. She told him that the accusations against Martin Thatcher had never been substantiated, never formally charged, and never adjudicated. She told him that to present them as fact in a public newspaper was both factually wrong and potentially actionable. She put her documentation portfolio on his desk and invited him to read it. She said she would wait. Pratt read it. He read it slowly and carefully, which told her he was a real journalist under the combativeness, someone who cared about the difference between true and false even when it was inconvenient. He read it for 20 minutes without saying anything. Then he looked up. "Where did you get the water rights survey from 1871? He asked. "The county records office in Wichita," she said. "I wrote for it 4 weeks ago before I came." He looked at Arthur, who had been standing quietly near the door. You knew about this. I knew she was coming, Arthur said. I did not know about the survey. Pratt looked back at Mamie. I will run a correction next Thursday, he said. And I will write about the arbitration hearing properly. I would also like you to consider writing about Harlan Voss's interest in this matter, Mamie said. The irrigation scheme, I can provide documentation. Pratt looked at her for a long moment. That, he said, is a different kind of article. It is, she agreed. But it is accurate and it is relevant and it is something the people of this county have a right to know. Another silence. Pratt picked up his pen. Tell me about the irrigation scheme, he said. Outside on the boardwalk afterward in the bright morning sun, Arthur looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open and unguarded that she thought he might not know he was showing. Where did you learn to do that? He asked. Do what? Walk into a room and make it bend toward the truth, she laughed. It came out unexpectedly, a real laugh, and she felt it in her whole chest. 6 years in a law firm in St. Louis, she said. You learn things, he smiled. A full, unguarded smile, not the careful cousin of one. She had not seen it before, and now she was looking at it and thinking that it was possibly one of the finest things she had encountered in a long time, and also that she was in a great deal of trouble. We should celebrate, he said. Come have dinner with me tonight. The hotel dining room properly, not just coffee on the porch. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the morning sun was warm and the street smelled of dust and horses and fresh bread from the bakery 2 doors down, and she thought, yes. This is a yes moment. She had not had very many of them. Yes, she said. Dinner at the hotel dining room was the most elaborate social occasion Caldwell Creek had to offer in the summer of 1882, which was still considerably less elaborate than a St. Louis supper club, but had its own particular warmth and sincerity that the supper clubs could not have matched. Arthur had changed into a proper shirt and had done something about the 3 days of beard, and Mamie wore the better of the 2 dresses she had brought, a blue-gray wool that was too warm for the evening but was the right color for what she wanted to feel. She was aware that people looked at them. She was aware that they were an item of interest. She, the returned Thatcher girl, and he, the blacksmith's son who had always been well regarded, and was now apparently having dinner with a woman who was fighting Doyle Prentice in the county land arbitration. She found she did not care about any of that in the way she had expected to care. Or rather, she cared in the abstract, intellectually aware that she was being watched and judged, but the actual experience of it here now, sitting across from Arthur Keller, who was looking at her over the dinner table with that particular quality of attention, did not produce the shrinking feeling she would have predicted. They talked for 3 hours, about everything. The food was eaten and the plates removed and the coffee brought and the coffee cooled, and still they talked, moving easily between the serious and the light, between the past and the present, between the case and the wider world, between the things that needed to be said carefully and the things that could simply be said. He told her about a year he had spent in Abilene at 19 trying to decide what he wanted his life to be, and about the way the decision had resolved itself not through any dramatic revelation, but through the simple recognition that he was happiest when he was working with his hands and rooted in one place with people he knew. She told him about the early years in St. Louis when she had been very small and very alone in a city that had no particular interest in her, and about the way she had built a life there that was adequate and functional and had never quite felt like hers. What would it take for a place to feel like yours? He asked. She thought about it honestly. I think it needs people in it who see you as you are, not as you are according to what someone said about you, not as a version of yourself that was built out of someone else's story. He was quiet for a moment. You are seen, he said, here, by me. The directness of it was so unexpected that she felt her breath catch. He said it without performance, without the elaborate approach of a man who has prepared a romantic statement. He said it the way he listened to her, fully, simply, as if there were no other option. Arthur, she said. I know, he said. I know this is not the moment. You have a case to win and you have 3 weeks and then you will decide what you want to do. I'm not making a claim on anything. I only want you to know that I see you. You have been seeing me for 3 days, she said. I have been seeing you since you were 12 years old, he said. And then, as if this had possibly been too much honesty, he picked up his coffee cup. Which is not what it sounds like, given that I was then 14 and it was entirely platonic. She laughed again, the same real, unguarded laugh, and he smiled, and the tension in the moment resolved into something warmer and more generous than it had been. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her hotel room listening to the sounds of Caldwell Creek settling into night, the distant piano from the saloon, the horses in the livery, the occasional voice, and thought about Arthur Keller with the helpless thoroughness of someone who is developing feelings and knows it and cannot quite get themselves to stop. She had not planned for this. She had planned for a legal fight and a difficult month and then departure. She had not planned for gray-green eyes and a hand over hers in the dark, and the word scene said in a quiet voice over a cooling cup of coffee. The next week moved in 2 registers simultaneously. The urgent practical register of the case building toward the arbitration hearing, and the private interior register of something between herself and Arthur that was growing with the patient but unmistakable logic of a plant finding the light. They worked. Together and separately, they worked hard and carefully at the case. James Keller came into town and met with Horace Webb, and the old blacksmith was everything Arthur had described, solid and unhurried, and possessed of the particular authority of a man who has never asked for favors and is owed many. He knew the arbiters. He would speak to them. Not to beg or bargain, but to say plainly what he knew of the Thatcher family and what he thought of Doyle Prentice's claims. Gerald Pratt's Thursday paper came out with a carefully written piece about Harland Voss's irrigation interests and their connection to the land dispute. And by Saturday, the county commissioner was having what people described as a very unpleasant time at his own dinner parties. The article did not accuse anyone of anything illegal. It simply laid out the financial relationships clearly and asked a few quiet questions. Gerald Pratt, it turned out, was a good journalist when he was operating on accurate information. Mamie rode out to her mother's land 3 times that week, gathering neighbor testimony, walking the fence lines, photographing nothing because there was no camera but drawing careful maps and measurements. She found 2 neighbors who had been watching Prentice's men try to remove some of the older boundary markers, and she documented that with statements from both neighbors, written and signed. Prentice sent a man to the hotel to tell her that her accommodations would not continue to be available to her after the following week. He apparently had some connection with the hotel ownership, and Arthur learned of this through the small-town information network that functions in any place where everyone knows everyone, and went directly to the hotel owner, a man named Forsyth, and had what Mamie understood to have been a brief but extremely effective conversation. After which her accommodations were confirmed for as long as she needed them. She did not ask him what he had said. He did not tell her. She suspected it had had something to do with who had shod Forsyth's horses for the past 8 years, and who would be shod by no one in this county if Forsyth decided to be Prentice's instrument in this matter, though she acknowledged this was speculation. "What did you say to Forsyth?" She asked him that evening on the porch. "We discussed horses," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with complete innocence. "You are surprisingly devious for a blacksmith," she said. "A blacksmith has leverage in a cattle town," he said. "I do not use it often, but I am not above using it when someone is trying to put a woman out of her hotel on behalf of a dishonest man." She was looking at him with what she suspected was a very obvious expression. He was looking back at her with an expression that was increasingly familiar to her, that not quite contained thing, the openness just below the surface. "Arthur," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to tell you something." He waited. "I have been trying," she said, "to keep this orderly in my mind, you and the case and what comes after. I have been trying to keep them separate because it seemed like the sensible thing to do, not to add personal complications to an already complicated situation. That does seem sensible, he agreed carefully. And I am finding, she said, that I am not particularly good at it. He was very still. I think, she said, that I would like to know what this is between us, after the case is finished, if that is something you also want. He was quiet for long enough that she began to review the conversation for errors, and then he said, quietly and completely, I have wanted to know what this is since you were standing outside the land office with your papers in your bag, and you said hello to me like you had not been gone 12 years and like you were not afraid of anything. I was afraid of everything, she said. I know, he said. That is why it was remarkable. He reached over in the dark and found her hand again, and this time it was not about steadying. It was about the simple fact of touching. And she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat there in the warm Kansas night with the stars very large overhead, and did not say anything else for a long time, because nothing else needed to be said. 2 days before the arbitration hearing, Prentice made his last move. It was not elegant. Elegant had run out of road for him, given Pratt's articles and James Keller's conversations, and the fact that the documentation Mamie had assembled was very difficult to argue with on its merits. His last move was to revive the story. Not directly. He was not entirely without calculation. He did it through a man named Chester Hollies, who was a friend of his and who had a habit of holding forth loudly in the saloon after a few drinks. Chester Hollies, who had been present at the original accusations against Martin Thatcher 12 years ago, began to tell people that the Thatcher girl had come back not to help her mother, but to access hidden money that her father had supposedly concealed before his death. It was the same story dressed up with new details. It was, in the way of these things, beginning to circulate. Arthur heard it on a Tuesday night and told Mamie Wednesday morning. He told her calmly and with the specific detail of a man who has learned exactly what was being said and by whom and at what times. She listened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to go to the saloon tonight. Arthur looked at her. Not to drink, she said. To be there, to be visible, to let people look at me and hear me speak and make up their own minds based on the person in front of them rather than the story Chester Hollies is telling. He was quiet for a moment. That is a bold thing, he said. Yes, she agreed. I will come with you, he said. You do not have to. I know I do not have to, he said. They went that evening. The Red Dog Saloon was not the roughest establishment in Caldwell Creek. That title belonged to the other saloon at the north end of the street, but it was the most popular, and on a Wednesday evening in high summer with the cattle trade in full swing, it was full of people who represented the full range of the town's population. Ranch hands and merchants and town tradespeople and the ordinary citizens who simply wanted a drink in the company of others. They walked in together. Arthur knew people. He greeted them. He introduced Mamie, not as the Thatcher girl, not with any defensive preamble, but simply as Mamie Thatcher, as if she were a person deserving of the direct courtesy of her own name. She shook hands and spoke to people, and answered questions about the land case when they were asked, directly and without evasion, and said clearly that the accusations against her father had been false, and that she had documentation to prove it, and that it would be presented at the arbitration hearing on Friday. Chester Hollies was there. He did not approach her. He watched her from across the room with the discomfort of a man who has told a story about someone, and is now required to stand in the same room with them while they breathe the same air and are clearly an ordinary human being. She did not approach him either. She did not need to. Her presence was its own argument. At one point she was standing at the bar talking to a woman named Clara who ran the bakery, explaining the water rights situation, and she looked across the room and found Arthur watching her from where he stood with 2 of his friends. And the expression on his face was something that she filed away in a place she intended to return to later and look at for a long time. They walked back to the hotel side by side in the quiet of the late evening, the street nearly empty. You were remarkable in there, he said. I was terrified, she said. You were both, he said. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. They were standing in the middle of the empty street with the dark sky above and the hotel light visible at the end of the block. "Arthur," she said. He turned to face her fully. "I know we said after the case," she said. "I know we said we would figure out what this is after the case, but I need to tell you something now. I need to say it now because I have spent 12 years not saying things because they were not the right time or the right place or the right circumstance, and I have decided that policy has not served me as well as I thought." "All right," he said. "I am in love with you," she said. "I am aware that is very fast, and I am aware that we have known each other again for only 12 days, and I am not asking you to." He kissed her. He stepped forward and took her face in both his big, careful hands and kissed her in the middle of the empty street in Caldwell Creek, Kansas, in the summer of 1882. And it was the most honest thing that had happened to her in a very long time, possibly ever. She put her hands over his and kissed him back with everything she had been carrying for 12 days and 12 years. When they stopped, they were both breathing differently. He rested his forehead against hers. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since you were 14 years old and you stood in front of my father's smithy and told me that what people were saying about your father was lies, and that you were going to remember who believed you because someday it would matter. And then you left, and I have thought about that girl, and then about you, ever since." She laughed against his cheek, a wet laugh because her eyes were doing something she had not given them permission to do. "Why did you not say so when I arrived?" she said. "Because you arrived to fight a case," he said, "and because you had been gone 12 years and you did not owe me anything because I had thought about you." She stepped back and looked at him. "Arthur James Keller," she said, "you are the most infuriating man." "I prefer thoughtful," he said. She laughed again and he smiled, the full unguarded one, and she thought, This is what a place feeling like yours looks like. This is what it is made of." The arbitration hearing was held on a Friday morning in the county meeting hall, a building that smelled of sawdust and old paper and served multiple functions throughout the week, including church overflow and town council meetings. The three-man arbitration panel sat at a long table at the front. Horace Webb represented the Thatcher claim. A lawyer named Fitch, who had been brought in from Wichita by Prentice, represented the challenge. Doyle Prentice sat behind Fitch in a good suit. Harland Voss, to the surprise of no one who had read Gerald Pratt's articles, was conspicuously absent. The hearing room was more full than Mamie had expected. The people of Caldwell Creek had opinions about this case that they had apparently decided required physical presence to express properly. She saw faces she had been speaking to all week, neighbors who had given statements, townspeople she had met in the saloon. James Keller sat in the second row, his big hands on his knees, his white hair brushed neatly. Arthur sat beside him. Horace Webb was, as he had suggested he might be, not a fiery advocate. He was precise and organized and methodical, and he presented the documentation in exactly the order Mamie had organized it, which was the order she had designed to be most persuasive. The original land grant, the continuous tax payments, the water rights survey, the neighbor statements, the documented attempts to remove boundary markers, the statements regarding Ruth Thatcher's continuous residence. It was, as a body of evidence, extremely difficult to argue with. Fitch tried. He was a better lawyer than Webb in the theatrical sense, louder, more aggressive, more comfortable with implication and insinuation. He argued abandonment with considerable energy. He raised, with careful indirection, the question of the Thatcher family's reputation. He suggested that the documentation's chain of custody was irregular. He did all of these things competently. And then James Keller was called to speak. He did not testify about the law. He testified about what he knew. He said he had known Martin Thatcher for the better part of 20 years and had never known him to be dishonest in any transaction, personal or business. He said he had watched Ruth Thatcher work that land through 2 droughts and a bad winter and the deaths of her husband and her son, and had never seen it abandoned. He said he had known Doyle Prentice's business practices for many years and would not, were he in the position of the panel, take that man's word about another person's character without considerable verification. He said it all in the tone of a man who has spent 63 years building a reputation in one place and is spending a small portion of it now, deliberately and without regret, on something he considers important. The panel consulted. It took 40 minutes. Mamie sat in the front row and did not move during those 40 minutes. She sat with her hands in her lap and her spine straight and looked at the middle distance and breathed. She felt Arthur's hand settle on her shoulder from the row behind her, warm and brief and certain, and then it was gone. The panel ruled in favor of the Thatcher claim. The abandonment challenge was dismissed as unsupported by the evidence. The original land grant was reconfirmed. Doyle Prentice's representative immediately indicated that the decision would be appealed, and Horace Webb immediately indicated that the appeal would be vigorously defended, and the matter was, for practical purposes, resolved. The land was Ruth Thatcher's. It had always been Ruth Thatcher's. The room erupted in the controlled way that county meeting halls erupt, not with shouting but with a great deal of sudden conversation. Mamie sat for a moment in her chair and felt the 40 minutes of held breath leave her body all at once. She turned around. Arthur was right there. She stood up and he took her hands in both of his and they looked at each other in the bright crowded room and she said, "We won." And he said, "You won." And she said, "We won," again because it was true. And then she was laughing and he was laughing too, and people were coming to congratulate her, and she shook their hands and thanked them with great sincerity while being entirely aware of Arthur standing beside her, solid and present and warm. Later, after the crowd had dispersed, and Webb had collected the documents and Prentice had left without speaking to her, she stood outside the meeting hall on the wooden steps in the afternoon sun. The appeal notice would be filed within the week, Webb had told her. It would take time. They would need to prepare. The case was not entirely over. She thought about what that meant. She thought about it with the part of her mind that had already begun, somewhere in the past 2 weeks, to think about whether Caldwell Creek was a place she might stay. Arthur came and stood beside her on the steps. "The appeal will take months," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "I would need to remain accessible to Webb for consultation. There may be additional documentation requirements. It would be impractical to manage that from St. Louis." "It would," he said. She looked at him sidelong. He was looking at the street with an expression of studied neutrality that she had come to understand meant he was being extremely careful not to influence her. "Arthur, I am not saying anything," he said. "You are being very quiet on purpose," she said. "I am being very quiet because this is your decision and I want you to make it for yourself," he said. "Not for me." "What if I want to make it for both of us?" He turned to look at her. The studied neutrality was gone. He looked at her with the full, open expression, the one she was coming to love, and said, "Then I would say that I have been wanting to ask you something since Tuesday night in the middle of the street, and I was waiting until after the hearing because the hearing needed to happen first." Her heart was doing something considerable. "Ask me," she said. He turned to face her properly, both of them standing on the steps in the afternoon sun with the main street of Caldwell Creek busy and indifferent behind them, and he said, "I want to court you properly, Mamie Thatcher. I want to take my time about it and do it right. And at the end of it, if you will have me, I want to marry you. I am not asking you to decide that now. I am asking you to stay long enough for us to find out." She looked at him. She looked at the town around him, the smithy at the end of the street, the newspaper office, the hotel, the distant line of the western plain where her mother's land lay under the wide sky. "I will stay," she said, "for the appeal, and for the other." He smiled, the full, unguarded, whole-faced smile that she had decided was one of her favorite things in the world, and he offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked down the steps together into the afternoon. The appeal process took 3 months, as Webb had predicted, and during those 3 months Caldwell Creek and Mamie Thatcher reached an understanding that was both practical and profound. She arranged for her things to be sent from St. Louis. She was not deceiving herself about what the decision meant. She was choosing to put roots down in the same ground that had uprooted her, which was either courageous or foolish, and she had decided she did not particularly care which. She rented a small house at the east end of the main street, 2 blocks from the smithy. She was not going to live in the hotel indefinitely, and she was not going to move in with her mother, because she was 26 years old and wanted her own space, and Ruth Thatcher's house was Ruth Thatcher's house. The rental house was small and needed work, and she liked it immediately. Gerald Pratt, who had somewhere in the previous weeks become something approaching an ally, offered her occasional work reviewing legal documents for the paper and writing up summaries of county business for the Courier. She was good at it. She discovered she liked it in the way she had not quite liked the secretarial work in St. Louis. It connected her to the place, made her feel woven into its daily functions in a real way. Arthur courted her with the same quality he brought to everything he did, steadily, thoroughly, with complete attention. He came to call on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. On Sundays after church, he came to her mother's land with her and helped with whatever needed doing. In the evenings on her rented porch rather than the hotel porch they sat and talked, and the conversations went deeper and further than any she could remember having with anyone. He told her about things he had never told anyone. He said his periods of doubt about whether a life in one small town was enough, the loneliness of his 20s when everyone he knew seemed to be moving forward in ways he could not quite identify or replicate, the way he had made peace with it eventually, by deciding that the quality of a life was not measured by its range of movement. She told him things she had never told anyone too about the months after leaving Caldwell Creek when she had been so frightened and alone that she had wondered if it would ever be better, about the way she had built a harder exterior over the years out of self-protection, and what it cost, about what it felt like to have that exterior prove unnecessary when she was around him. They laughed a great deal. This was something she had not expected, not just the tenderness and the serious conversations, but the laughter. He had a dry wit that announced itself quietly, and she found it consistently and helplessly delightful. She made him laugh too, she discovered, which gave her a pleasure that was almost embarrassingly large. He kissed her in the evenings on the porch with the contained thoroughness of a man who has considerable feeling and considers it important to demonstrate it carefully, and she kissed him back with the openness of a woman who has decided that being guarded is a habit worth breaking. In late October, when the nights had turned cold and the appeal hearing was scheduled for the first week of November, he came to call on a Tuesday evening with something different in his manner, a particular focus, a deliberateness that she clocked from across the room. She was reading by the lamp. She put down the paper. "What is it?" she said. He did not sit down. He stood in the middle of her small rented parlor and looked at her and said, "I have a question, and I told you I would wait until we knew each other well enough, and I believe we do." She put the paper down completely. "I bought land," he said, "2 months ago. I did not say anything because I wanted to be sure you were staying for yourself and not because of any plan I had. It is on the eastern creek, half a mile from your mother's place. Good land level with good water. There is a house on it that needs considerable work, which is fine because I am good at considerable work." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me, Mamie Thatcher. I want you to be my wife. I want to build that house with you and live in it and have our life together in it in this place, which is your place as much as it is mine, if you are willing to let it be." She stood up. She walked across the small parlor and stopped in front of him and looked up at him, this big quiet man with the gray-green eyes and the careful hands and the endless patient capacity for her, and she felt the full weight of the moment, all the years and the distance and the loss and the returning, all of it present in this small room on this cold October night. "Yes," she said. "Arthur, yes. Absolutely yes." He let out a breath and pulled her close and held her with those big blacksmith's arms, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt his heartbeat under her ear, fast and definite and real. He kissed the top of her head. She laughed against his chest. "You bought land 2 months ago," she said. "I was confident," he said. "That is presumptuous," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I'm also good at considerable work, as I mentioned, so it balanced out." She laughed again, fully and freely, and he laughed too, and the cold October parlor was very warm. The appeal hearing came and went in November, and it went well. The documentation was solid, the argument was clear, and Fitch's appeal lacked the only thing it might have won on political support from Harland Voss, whose name had not been improved by Gerald Pratt's articles, and who had quietly withdrawn from public involvement with Prentice's matter sometime in September. The appeal was denied. The Thatcher land claim was confirmed, finally and permanently, in Ruth Thatcher's name. Mamie stood outside the county hall after the hearing with Webb beside her and Arthur on her other side, and the cold November air on her face, and felt the closure of it. Not just the legal closure, but the deeper one. The thing that Doyle Prentice had done to her family 12 years ago, the story he had told, the reputation he had buried, it had not been fully undone, because these things are never fully undone. The past stays past. But the land was safe. Her mother was safe. And Gerald Pratt's accurate and well-researched coverage of both the original injustice and the present case meant that the record existed now. Martin Thatcher's name existed in the written record of Caldwell Creek, not only as the accused, but as the man who had been wrongly accused, and the accusation and the truth were both there for anyone who looked. It was not everything. But it was something real, and it was permanent, and it was won. Prentice did not approach her again after the appeal. He was a man who moved to the next scheme when a current one was exhausted, and Mamie was no longer surprised by this quality in him, only watchful of it, in the way that you remain watchful of something that has bitten you once. She and Arthur were married in the white church with the bell that needed replacing on the second Saturday of December, 1882. The church was full. Mamie wore a dress that had been made by a seamstress in town over the preceding 6 weeks, a cream wool dress that was exactly right for a December wedding in Kansas, and that she had described to the seamstress with a clarity of vision that had surprised herself. Ruth Thatcher sat in the front row and wept happily from the first moment to the last. James Keller sat beside her and was formally dignified about it, which meant his eyes were bright, and his handshake for his son afterward was the handshake of a man containing a great deal of feeling in the most formal possible container. Arthur waited for her at the front of the church with the expression she had come to love most on him, the full open one, nothing held back, looking at her like she was both exactly what he had expected and more than he could have said. She walked toward him and felt her heart beating in a way she was certain was medically excessive and completely appropriate. The minister said the words. They said the words back. He put a ring on her finger, a simple band, made at his own forge, because of course it was. She had cried a little at that when he told her about it, and he had accepted this with the satisfaction of a man who has done exactly the right thing. They kissed at the altar, and the church made the sound that churches make at this moment when they are full of people who are genuinely glad about the thing happening in front of them. The reception was in the meeting hall, which had been transformed from its weekday severity by ribbons and lanterns, and the efforts of a dozen women who took this kind of occasion seriously. There was food and there was music, a fiddle player named Amos and a man who played the guitar, and they played reels and waltzes and one slow ballad that cleared the floor except for Arthur and Mamie, who danced to it alone, while everyone watched them in the good, warm, uncomplicated way that people watch two people who are meant for each other finally dancing together. Ruth Thatcher danced with James Keller during a reel. Neither of them would have described this as a notable event. Everyone present described it to each other as a notable event. They moved into the house on the Eastern Creek in February, after Arthur had spent 3 months working on it every spare hour he had. He had done the structural work himself and hired help for the plastering and roofing. And what had been a house in poor condition was now a house that was solid and bright, with good windows and a kitchen that had a proper stove and a porch that faced both the creek and the eastern sky. Mamie had opinions about all of it, strongly held and clearly expressed, and Arthur had incorporated them all without argument, because he had understood from the beginning that this was to be her house as much as his, and he had not bought the land imagining something else. She kept writing for Gerald Pratt's newspaper. The work had grown into something she had not anticipated. What had begun as occasional legal summaries had expanded, under her own initiative and Pratt's increasingly enthusiastic support, into regular coverage of county government and land matters that quickly became the most read section of the Courier. She wrote clearly and accurately, and without fear of whom she might inconvenience, which in a county with active political interests made her writing interesting. She rode out to her mother's land twice a week. Ruth had good seasons and harder seasons. Her health was not strong, and the winters were difficult. But she was on her land and she was herself, and Mamie understood that this was what her mother had needed most from the whole fight, not just the legal victory, but the fact of continuing to be herself in the place she had chosen. In the spring of 1883, Mamie became aware with the particular knowing of a woman's body that something new was happening. She told Arthur on a Tuesday evening, sitting on the new porch with the creek sound coming up from below, and the March air still cold, but beginning to carry the first trace of warmth that meant the season was turning. She told him simply and directly as she told him everything. He was quiet for a moment that was too long and too full to be quite ordinary silence, and then he looked at her with an expression that was new, something she had not seen before, and she realized it was wonder. Simple, uncomplicated, enormous wonder. He said her name, just that. He said it in a way that contained everything. She took his hand. He held hers with the careful pressure she knew, not tight, not loose, exactly the right amount. Their son was born in November of 1883. He was a big, loud, healthy boy with Arthur's jaw and Mamie's eyes, which she counted as an excellent arrangement. They named him Martin James Keller, for her father and his, which made both old men considerably more emotional than either of them would have admitted in any official capacity. Martin James Keller was voted the most satisfying name at 2 family dinners simultaneously without any coordination, which Arthur pointed out was statistically remarkable. The baby was strong and vocal, and had opinions about sleeping that differed from his parents' opinions in ways that made the first several months memorably eventful. He also had, from very early on, a quality that both Mamie and Arthur noticed independently, and then confirmed to each other with some awe. He was interested in everything. He watched the world with concentrated attention, and when something was shown to him, even at 6 months, his face showed the particular expression of a person who is filing information away for later use. Ruth Thatcher, who could not walk the distance to the house easily, received them on Sundays and held her grandson with the total absorption of a woman who has found a whole new category of happiness in the last season of her life. Martin James appeared to find his grandmother equally absorbing, and their Sunday hours together took on the quality of a mutual education in which neither party was entirely sure who was teaching whom. Gerald Pratt offered Mamie the position of contributing editor at the Courier in early 1884, which included a small salary and a formal designation. She accepted it with the brisk pleasure of someone who has been doing a job effectively for a while and is glad to have it named properly. Arthur's smithy continued to be indispensable to the county's function, and he expanded it that year with a second hearth and an apprentice, a 16-year-old named Thomas who had shown up asking for work with the earnest desperation of a boy who needed it and the natural aptitude of someone who might be good at it. Arthur taught him with the same patient, thorough attention he applied to everything. The spring of 1885 brought a second child, a daughter this time, born in April when the prairie was coming back to green, small and fierce and vocal from the first moment. They named her Clara Ruth, after the bakery woman who had been one of the first people in Caldwell Creek to speak kindly to Mamie on her return, and for Ruth Thatcher, who when she heard the name held her granddaughter and was silent for a long time, and then said only quietly that it was a very good name. Clara Ruth proved to be a person of considerable character from an early age. She had strong preferences about everything, and expressed them with a directness that made Arthur say, privately and with great affection, that she was entirely her mother's daughter, and Mamie said that this was both untrue and a compliment, and Arthur said it was definitely both. Doyle Prentice stayed in Caldwell Creek through this period, continuing his various business interests, having apparently concluded that the Thatcher land matter was finished, and that further engagement would be expensive and unsuccessful. He and Mamie passed each other on the street occasionally over the years with the mutual acknowledgement of two people who have faced each other in a serious matter and know exactly where they stand. He never approached her directly again. She never sought him out. The understanding between them was clear and permanent. Ruth Thatcher died in the winter of 1886 in her own house on her own land with Mamie beside her. It was not sudden. The winters had been wearing on her for 2 years and the autumn had shown the signs. And yet it was, when it came, as devastating as loss always is when you love someone with the uncomplicated wholeness that daughters love mothers. Mamie held her mother's hand through the last night and felt the grief as something absolute, a weight that she carried from that night forward in the particular way that grief works when it is grief for a good person well loved. Arthur was there. He had been there through the 2 hard weeks of her mother's final illness, coming every day, managing the practical things with a quiet competence that freed Mamie to simply be present with her mother without the added weight of logistics. He held Mamie on the night Ruth died with the completeness of a man who knows that there is nothing useful to say and does not try to say it. They buried Ruth Thatcher on her land beside Martin Thatcher, under a sky that was white and cold and enormous. The neighbors came, and people from town, and James Keller, who stood by the grave with his hat in his hands and said nothing but was completely present. After walking back to the house to meet the children who had been kept with Arthur's sister during the burial, Mamie looked out at the land, the acres of flat Kansas plain running to the creek, her father's fence lines, her mother's garden, the winter-dry grass that would come back green in the spring, and felt something that was grief and also something else. The land was hers now. She had not wanted it to be hers this way. She would have traded every acre to have her mother back. But the land was hers and it was real, and it was the thing her parents had built and held through every assault against it, and she would hold it too. She would hold it and work it and pass it on. They leased the Thatcher land to a family named Sorensen, who had come up from Oklahoma Territory, a young couple with 2 children who needed good land and were willing to work it properly. Mamie knew them within a season as good people, the kind who care for what is given to them, who understand that land is not merely property, but a thing with a history and a future that you are temporarily part of. The Sorensens kept Ruth's garden and added to it, and the fence line stayed good, and the house stayed sound. Martin James grew into a boy of great curiosity and considerable energy, who had decided by age 7 that he wanted to know how everything worked, which made him his father's natural apprentice at the smithy on Saturday mornings, and his mother's most ardent student when she sat down with the newspaper to explain what the words meant and why they mattered. By 8 he could identify the basic operations of a forge, and could read adult prose with a comprehension that his mother was objectively, measurably proud of, though she was careful not to let that pride make him insufferable about it. Clara Ruth, younger and fiercer, had decided by age 5 that she was going to be involved in any conversation that was happening near her, and by age 6 had opinions about the newspaper articles her mother wrote that she delivered without solicitation. She had also, to Arthur's considerable delight, a natural feeling for animals. She moved around the horses at the smithy with an instinctive calmness that they responded to, and she had appointed herself the guardian of every stray dog within half a mile of the house. Mamie's work at the Courier continued to develop. In 1887, she published a series of 3 articles about land rights practices in Caldwell Creek County that prompted a county council inquiry into several practices that had been operating in the same informal way as Voss's irrigation scheme, the accumulation of advantage through relationships rather than merit. The articles were careful and documented and created an amount of controversy that made Gerald Pratt, who had by now become something genuinely approaching a friend, both nervous and proud. 2 of the practices were formally investigated. One was changed by vote of the council. It was not revolution. It was the kind of slow, incremental accountability that was the only kind available in these circumstances, and Mamie had learned long ago to take the incremental version when that was what was on offer. Arthur read everything she wrote. He read it at the kitchen table in the evenings after the children were in bed, and sometimes he made marginal notes in pencil, not corrections, because he had no corrections to offer but reactions, which she found she valued enormously. His responses were specific and thoughtful, and showed the reading of a man who took seriously what he was reading, and she had the recurring experience of feeling known by him in the way that she had been unable to articulate at 26 and had now lived in for 5 years. Their 4th anniversary fell in December of 1886, and Arthur took her to dinner at the hotel dining room, the same table, the same room where they had talked for 3 hours on the night she had called him surprisingly devious for a blacksmith. The hotel had been renovated the previous year, and the china was different and the menu had expanded. But the table by the east window was the same table, and the Kansas night outside was the same, black and cold and wide. He had a gift for her. He produced it from his coat pocket with the air of a man who was a little nervous about the reception, which she found deeply endearing. It was a small brooch made at his own forge, worked iron in the shape of a meadowlark. The bird that she had told him once early in their acquaintance she associated most strongly with this landscape, with Kansas, with home. She held it in her hands and looked at it for a long time. The workmanship was extraordinary, not just technically, though it was technically precise, but in the quality of attention it showed. The feathers were indicated with the same care as everything else he made, each one exactly where it should be, the whole bird alive in its stillness. "Arthur," she said. "It took 3 attempts," he said. "The first 2 I kept." She looked up at him. "Why did you keep the first 2? "Because they were not right," he said. "I did not want to give you something that was not right." She pinned the brooch to her dress at the shoulder, and he watched her do it with an expression that she understood perfectly: satisfaction and love, the 2 things that cannot always be distinguished from each other. "I love you," she said, "in case it bears repeating." "It always bears repeating," he said. The dinner was long and easy and good, the way their evenings together almost always were by now. They talked about the children and about the newspaper and about a project Arthur had been considering, a larger smithy, possibly with a small foundry operation, which would require significant investment and which he had been turning over in his mind for a year. She asked him the practical questions, and he answered them, and she could see him thinking as he answered, which she had always found beautiful in him. The way he thought carefully and out loud, the way he trusted her with the unfinished versions of his thoughts. They walked home from the hotel through the December cold, through the streets of the town that had been her battleground and was now her home, and she took his arm and felt the solid warmth of him beside her, and looked up at the black sky with its impossible density of stars and thought, "This is what I came back for, even though I did not know it. I came back for a legal fight, and I found something I did not know I was missing for 12 years. The spring of 1888 brought a 3rd child, another son born in May, named James Thomas after Arthur's father and the apprentice Thomas, who was now fully trained and running his own small operation, and who received this honor with a solemn dignity that made everyone present at the announcement try not to smile. James Thomas Keller was, from his first weeks, a calm and observant child, the opposite of his sister in temperament, and the complement to his brother in ways that seemed almost designed. He slept well, which after the experience of Martin's first year felt like a grace from a generous universe, and he watched the world with the same quality of interested attention that had characterized Martin, but at a slower, more patient pace. Arthur held his third child in the kitchen of the house on the eastern creek, with the May evening coming through the open window and the sound of the two older children playing outside, and Mamie watched him and thought, "I want to remember this exactly." She filed it away with the other things she filed away that she intended to keep forever: the meadowlark brooch, the full unguarded smile, his hand over hers in the dark, the word scene said over a cooling coffee cup in a hotel dining room in the summer of 1882. The world around them continued to be the world. The cattle trade in Caldwell Creek shifted and evolved as the open range began to close under the pressure of fencing and farming settlement, and the town's character changed accordingly. A little less rough, a little more permanent, the kind of change that the saloons noted in their dwindling trailhand business and the school noted in its growing enrollment. Arthur's smithy adapted as it always had, because iron and heat were fundamental to the work of every kind of life, whether cattle or farm or town, and he had learned from his father that the work itself was constant even when the world around it was not. Thomas, the apprentice who had become a colleague, married a girl named Hattie from the western side of the county, and settled 2 streets over from the Keller house and became, over the years, something like family. The children called him Uncle Thomas without being instructed to, and he accepted this with the straightforward pleasure of a man who had not expected it, and was glad of it. Doyle Prentice died in the summer of 1889. He died of an ordinary cause, a heart that stopped at 71, in his own house, surrounded by his considerable property. Mamie heard about it the same day everyone else in Caldwell Creek heard about it, over the back fence from her neighbor, and she stood for a moment with the wash on the line and the May sun on her back and thought about it honestly. She did not feel triumph, and she did not feel grief. She felt the particular neutral settling of a thing that has been a presence in your life for a long time being removed from it. Not resolution, exactly, because the things Prentice had done to her family were not undone by his death, but a kind of finality, a closing. She told Arthur that evening. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your father outlived his reputation in this town. Prentice did not. It was true. It was simply and accurately true." She put her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch with the warm summer evening around them and let the truth of it settle. The article she wrote about Prentice for the Courier was professional and fair, a factual accounting of his business interests and his role in the life of the county, without either eulogy or condemnation, with a paragraph that referenced the 1882 land dispute and its resolution in terms that were, she thought, exactly as fair as she could make them and no fairer. Gerald Pratt read it through twice and said it was exactly right. Martin James was 17 in 1900, which meant that Mamie was 44 and Arthur was 48, and the world they were living in had changed considerably since the summer of 1882 without losing, in any of the ways that mattered to them, its essential character. There was a railroad stop now, and the telegraph office had become something much more connected to the wider world, and the newspaper Mamie edited had grown from a single-sheet Courier to a proper 4-page weekly, with a reputation in the county that extended to readers in 3 neighboring territories. Martin was talking about going east to study engineering. He had been talking about it for 2 years, with the increasing seriousness of someone who has decided something and is now working out the practical architecture of it. Arthur had listened to all of it and said little until Martin asked him directly what he thought. And then he had said, with the characteristic care of a man who weighs his words, that he thought Martin should go if he wanted to go, and that the house on the Eastern Creek would be here when he came back if he chose to come back, and that the decision was his to make in his own time, and that whatever he chose would have the full support of both his parents. Martin went east in September of 1900, on a Thursday morning on the eastbound train, and Mamie stood on the platform and watched the train pull out and held Arthur's hand with both of hers and did not cry until the train was out of sight, and then cried properly for about 4 minutes and then stopped and straightened up and said she was fine. And Arthur said she did not have to be fine, and she said she actually was, that it was a good thing and she knew it was a good thing. And he said he knew she knew, and they walked back from the platform together in the September sun. Clara Ruth at 15 was a force of nature, and they both knew she would go in her own direction when the time came, possibly sideways and more rapidly than anticipated. She had her mother's pen. She had been writing things since she could hold a pencil, and by 13 had been contributing to the Courier under her full name, with a matter-of-fact confidence that Mamie encouraged without qualification, and Arthur supported with the quiet certainty of a man who has watched his wife write the truth for 20 years and knows it matters. James Thomas at 12 was still the calm center of the household, the one who read deeply and spoke rarely, and surprised everyone twice a year with a single observation that was so accurate it stopped conversation entirely. He had decided, without announcing it as a decision, to learn the smithy trade, and Arthur had begun teaching him on Saturday mornings with the same patient thoroughness he had applied to Thomas a decade and a half before. The house on the Eastern Creek was full and warm and busy, full of books and newspapers and the smell of iron that Arthur brought home in his clothes every evening, and that had become, for Mamie, one of the defining scents of contentment. They had built things into its walls over the years, not literally, though Arthur had done some of that too, but the things that accumulate when two people live honestly in one place for a long time, decisions made and kept, arguments had and resolved, sorrows carried together, laughter that surprised you with how good it felt even the 100th time. On a Thursday evening in October of 1900, with James Thomas in bed and Clara Ruth reading by the lamp, and the autumn air coming cold through the windows they had left open a crack because they both liked the smell of the night air, Arthur and Mamie sat together at the kitchen table the way they had sat 1,000 times, with coffee and the newspaper between them. He was reading something she had written earlier in the week, a piece about the changing nature of the cattle trade and what it meant for the county's future, and making his pencil notes in the margin, and she was watching him read with the attention that she had never lost, the pleasure of watching his mind move across the page. He looked up and found her watching him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I am looking at you." "I know," he said. "You have a particular expression when you are looking at me." "And what expression is that?" He considered it with the gravity he applied to most things. "Like someone who found something they thought was lost," he said, "and is making sure it is still there." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. He turned his hand over and held hers. The lamp was warm between them. Clara Ruth turned a page in the other room. Outside, the Eastern Creek moved steadily over its stones in the October night, the same sound it had made for all the years of their life on this land, patient and continuous, carrying everything forward. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said. He turned her hand over and looked at it, the way he sometimes did, as if it were something worth examining. "I have loved you since you were standing in the dust outside the land office with your papers in your bag and your chin up and no fear showing at all." "I was terrified," she said. "You were not afraid of what you were doing, though," he said. "Only of how it might go. That is a very different kind of terrified." She thought about that. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stage that summer afternoon 18 years ago with her carpetbag and her documents and her carefully constructed resolve, into the town that had buried her name. She thought about who she had been then and who she was now, sitting at this kitchen table in this house on this land with this man's hand holding hers. You refused to let it stay buried, she said quietly. He looked at her. You would have dug it up yourself, he said. You did not need me for that. No, she agreed, but it was better with you. She squeezed his hand. Everything is better with you. The lamp burned warm and steady. The creek moved outside in the dark. Somewhere to the west, her parents' land lay under the stars, tended now by the Sorensons' second generation, the children of the original family, who had been born on it and knew it as theirs in the way that children know the land they grow up on. Martin Thatcher's name was in the county record as it should be, accurate and vindicated. Ruth Thatcher's grave was on her own land, as she would have wanted. And here was Mamie Thatcher Keller at this kitchen table in the house that had been built for her, holding the hand of the man who had said her name on a boardwalk and meant something by it that he had always meant. And the life they had made was solid and real and theirs, fully and irrevocably theirs, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.